With a new NBA season upon us, I want to do something that I do pretty much every single year, and that is rank the future of every single NBA team. Their draft picks, their assets, their young players, their young core, whatever you want to call it. How well set up are they for the future? And I've done this the last couple of years, and when I do it, I like to put each of these teams in tiers and then obviously rank them throughout those tiers as well. And in the bottom tier, the worst futures, these are teams that have no future. There are three teams. We have the LA Clippers, the LA Lakers, and the Phoenix Suns, who definitely are repeat offenders in this category. Let's begin with the Clippers. It's very simple. It's very obvious. They lose Paul George in the offseason, who you can think whatever you want to about Paul George. He's old. He's got a ton of injury issues. They were probably going to be at this point in the list, regardless of whether he was on the team, but they're significantly worse now. They don't have future draft assets. They owe future picks to a variety of teams over the next couple of seasons. They don't have any young prospects. It's very simple why the Clippers are there. The Lakers are there for a very similar reason, although I think their future is a little bit brighter because they don't owe as many picks, and they have a couple of guys, whether it be Dalton Connect and Austin Reeves, that are going to be some part of their future, as well as Anthony Davis, still being not necessarily young, but he's not on the injury level of someone like Kawhi or formerly Paul George. And then obviously he is younger than James Harden. I'm not counting Bronny in the future of the Lakers, by the way. And then the Phoenix Suns also are in this like super duper all-in category. They've got KD, they've got Booker, they've got Beal. They don't have any future picks. They don't really have a ton of, young players are super excited about, except for, maybe Ryan Dunn's going to be a nice role player for them, but no real asset. They're above the two LA teams because Devin Booker's on the team and he's still very good. And no matter what happens with KD and Beal, like Booker is still an asset for them, but those are the three worst futures in the league to me. Next up in tier 4, all of these teams are just jumbled together. The tag for this tier is essentially either these are all-in teams that still have some assets, or we have no idea what they are. They're just some collection of young guys that might be good, might not be. To begin this tier isn't necessarily ranked in order because they're all so similar in terms of how I feel about each of them. That's why they're in the same tier. Beginning of the tier is the Miami Heat. They owe some future picks. Jimmy Butler is old. They've got some solid pieces, like Bam is very good, but I don't think he's going to improve much more. Tyler Hero is at least relatively interesting, although I don't think the league values him very highly. Jaime Jaquez is interesting. They've got Khalil Ware. They got some pieces, but it's just not a group that I think is going to fetch a ton in return for a trade other than Bam. And given their age, given some of the future picks that they owe, I'm putting Miami in the tier 4 group. Next up is Milwaukee. The only reason the Bucks are not in the bottom tier is because they have Giannis. And honestly, this is pretty much as low as you could possibly rank in this exercise when you have an MVP caliber player on your team in Giannis Antetokounmpo. The rest of the team, in terms of future, and of course in terms of having future draft picks, they don't have any. The rest of the team is set up so poorly for the future. Chris Middleton, old and injured. Dame, old and probably going to get injured. Brook Lopez, old and always gets injured. And then the rest of the role guys, there's really not anybody to point to as the, hey, this guy could turn into something player on the roster. And in a couple of years, you might be dealing with Giannis potentially leaving rumors. Milwaukee has to be in this tier to me. Next up, we have the Chicago Bulls, who certainly are not all in. It's not like they owe a ton of future picks. It's just, I don't really know what they are. I don't know who the cornerstone players are. Like Kobe White's really good. Patrick Williams is solid, I guess. They gave him a big contract. They've got a bunch of young guys, like the kid that they drafted this year. Alonzo's coming back. DeSumo's still on the roster. They traded for Josh Giddey. I don't really love any of their pieces as like some kind of foundational future all-star, future all-NBA kind of guy. There's just not a lot going on with their young core or their assets. Next up, the Philadelphia 76ers. They honestly would be lower given the injury concerns long-term with Embiid and Paul George. And of course, they owe some future picks, but Tyrese Maxey's really good and he's young and he's still going to be a foundational piece for them. You could argue for Philadelphia to be actually up a little bit higher than this. I ultimately landed here because if Embiid and Paul George in a year or two are just not the same guys because of injuries, their future looks very, very bleak. Another all-in team, I put the New York Knicks in this tier. Again, this isn't necessarily a list to say that the team is bad. I think the Knicks are going to be the 2 or the 3 seed in the East this year, maybe even the 1 seed, depending on how the Celtics regular season goes. They're very good. It's just they have clearly mortgaged their future to be really good. They've traded all these picks away to a team like the Nets. They have brought in guys that are good but aging or have potential injury issues, like someone like OG Anunoby. The Knicks in 2-3 years are probably still going to be good, but they're going to be expensive. They have the cat thing now. This one, kind of like Philly, they could have been a little higher, but I ultimately landed here for them. Next up, maybe a surprising one, the Golden State Warriors find them in this spot. It's partially because obviously the roster is getting older. Steph, Draymond, those guys are just not going to be the same here pretty soon. But also, I don't really know what's going on with the rest of the roster. I like Kuminga. I don't know how much value he actually has around the league. They clearly tried to go a little bit more all in by trying to trade for Paul George, trying to trade for Lauri Markkanen, successfully. Other than that, like Pajemski's pretty good. They have some interesting pieces. Again, maybe you could put them a little bit higher, but I'm just not that excited about any of the future pieces as like future All-NBA guys, except maybe Kuminga. Next up is the Portland Trailblazers. Again, another team you might be surprised to see here. Maybe Scoot Henderson's really good. It was a disaster of a rookie season. I have a hard time being really excited about him unless he shows us something significant in terms of improvement in year 2. Shaedon Sharpe is young and interesting. They got some other guys in the draft this year, but I'm just not that excited about any of their pieces. Like Jeremy Grant, DeAndre Ayton, these guys feel like negative assets at this point. I'm just not really sure where they're going or what they're doing. Detroit, kind of the same thing. The Pistons end up in this part of the list as well. I was surprised that I had them here, but like I feel like a Cade defender typically. I think Cade's probably going to be pretty good, but the rest of the roster, like Ivy doesn't seem to be a great fit there alongside Cade. They continue to draft guys in the top 5 and the top 7, add them to the roster. They bring in Tobias Harris, new coaching staff. Maybe I'll be more excited about them a couple of months into the season, but right now they just feel like a team without a direction that should have more real young talent than they actually do. The Atlanta Hawks find themselves in a similar spot there as well. Trae Young, depending on what his trade value is down the road, if they end up moving him, that's certainly a potential asset for them. They got some picks back, but they still owe some out to other teams as well. Jalen Johnson's good. They have some interesting young pieces there. Of course, they have Richeche as well. All of that feels very unproven in terms of a real core. They were pretty close to tier 3, but ultimately I landed on tier 4 for them. And to finish out this gigantic tier of teams, we have the Washington Wizards. It's kind of similar to a bunch of these other young teams where it's like, okay, they have some interesting guys. I like Bub Carrington. They added Alex Sar. They have some cap space. They have some assets. They can trade Kyle Kuzma for a first-round pick potentially this year, which has been a rumor for like 3 years at this point. But I don't really know where they're going, what they're doing, what their direction is. And so they kind of end up in this jumbled together group of teams in tier 4. But now we can kind of refine things a little bit. We get to tier 3, and these are teams that I either really like their young core or I really like the future assets and how they're positioning themselves for the future. In that tier is the Memphis Grizzlies, what I feel like is maybe the most forgotten about team in the entire NBA. They still have Ja, who, if he can figure some things out this year, should have a really good year. He's an all-NBA caliber player if he's got his head on straight. Jaren Jackson Jr. is there. Desmond Bane is there. They added Edey this offseason. I still think that this is a team that 4 to 5 years from now, if guys are healthy, is still going to be really good, and that is a nice place to be for their future, even though they do owe some future picks as a result of things like the Marcus Smart trade. I also put Utah in here. They were kind of in between the 3 and the 4 here, but I just like all of the future assets that they have. They have more assets than any of the teams that we talked about in the previous tier in terms of future draft picks, and they have a guy that is young and is like has had seasons where they're all NBA caliber in Lauri Markkanen. A couple of other interesting pieces on the roster as well. I actually feel pretty optimistic about where Utah is going if they can get a couple more cornerstone pieces. I also put Toronto on here. I had a lot of trouble ranking Toronto because I feel like I'm more of a Scotty Barnes defender than most people, and like quickly should be pretty good. They've got RJ Barrett. They've got some picks from the moves that they made last year, but doesn't feel like a team that has a ton of direction. Like if you tell me that Toronto wins 20-25 games this year, I wouldn't be surprised if that's the outcome. I don't know if they have the coaching situation figured out, but just because of a couple of the young pieces of their core, I did end up putting them in tier 3 as well. Keep in mind, these tiers are not ranked within the tier. They're just all kind of in the same group. Next up, a team that I had a difficult time ranking, and that is the Brooklyn Nets, because talent-wise, they're not very good. They've got some pieces they can probably get a first or two for, whether it be Nick Claxton, Cam Johnson, Dorian Finney-Smith. Cam Thomas is interesting to some people. I'm still kind of uncertain about where he ends up as an NBA player long-term. But they've got all these picks as well. They've got Philly picks. They've got Phoenix picks. They got some of their own picks back from Houston, which is huge. And a year from now, if they get the first pick in the draft and add Cooper Flagg to this group with all these future pieces, and things completely change for them, right? But for right now, I'm putting them in this tier just because the actual team is so bad, and I don't really have a lot of hope for the younger guys on the roster that they kind of can only be this high to me because of those future assets that they have. Next up on the list is Sacramento, another team that I really struggled with. I like De'Aaron Fox. Keegan Murray's good. They added DeMar. They have Sabonis as well. That's a nice core of players. A couple of other interesting young guys they're trying to develop off the bench. And I kept them here just because in an immediate sense, the Fox, Murray, Sabonis trio is gonna be good enough to win 45 games every year for the next couple of years. And so felt like I couldn't really put them lower than this, but I'm also not that optimistic about their ability to kind of break through to another level, whether it be because of how they have used their assets or an overall lack of assets there in Sacramento. Last up in this tier, I actually put Charlotte, which might surprise some people, but I am very optimistic about what Brandon Miller is going to be long-term as an NBA player. And LaMelo, if healthy, I would put him up there as well. A couple of other, semi-interesting guys if Mark Williams can be healthy, and obviously they drafted highly this year as well, but it's mostly about that backcourt amongst the teams that are kind of trying to figure it out. Detroit, some of these, Washington, some of these younger teams that have a couple of pieces. I feel really good about the future future of Brandon Miller and LaMelo Ball, if he can be healthy, for Charlotte in terms of the key foundational pieces. So that's why they ended up there. That is the end of tier 3. Now we get to tier 2, and these are teams that I like their core and I like the assets that they have, or they have an MVP caliber player that I really like and some decent assets as well. First up in this tier is Indiana. I think some people are pretty low on them coming into the year, felt like they overachieved last year making the conference finals. That's certainly the case, but still, Halliburton, Siakam, a couple of the other guys they have on the roster, I think that's a real foundation, and it's a group that should continue to grow and improve together. I still like the future of Indiana, even though I think it's kind of trendy right now to be down on the Pacers to talk about how they overachieved in the postseason last year. Tier 2, maybe a surprising team to not be in tier 1. I have the New Orleans Pelicans here. They obviously have a ton of young talent. They're trying to figure out the Brandon Ingram thing. They've got Zion. They've got Trey Murphy, Herb Jones. They traded for DeJounte Murray. CJ McCollum is still there. They still have some future picks, but those future picks actually aren't that great when you go and actually look at them. It's not like the Thunder where they have control over the Clippers picks moving forward. Like they're not that great. And so that kind of brings them down a little bit in that tier 2 section. Not to mention the fact that, the guy that's supposed to put them over the top, or the guys that were supposed to put them over the top, were Zion and Brandon Ingram. And we're just very uncertain on what those guys are going to look like long-term for New Orleans, or in Ingram's case, if he's even going to be there long-term. So a team that always feels like it's in that tier 1 group the last couple of years in terms of their future. I did put them down one tier this year just because of the actual on-court product needs to start resembling something a little bit more exciting, given some of the future draft picks not being as good as maybe we thought they would be a couple of years ago. Next up on the list, I put the Denver Nuggets. When you have Jokic, and he looks like he's still going to be really good for the next couple of seasons, arguably the best player in the league, and a couple of other pieces like Michael Porter Jr., Jamal Murray, some of the young guys they're going to be counting on, I really can't put them lower than tier 2 because of Jokic, because of how incredible he is as a player. Obviously, some injury concerns with Jamal Murray and Michael Porter Jr. long term. But again, this is just a Jokic thing. Like when I put the category together, it's like I like their core and their assets in tier 2, or I like their MVP. Jokic obviously is the MVP in that sentence. Next up, I put Cleveland. Cleveland is one of these, I feel like, forgotten teams going into the year. They resolved the Donovan Mitchell thing for now, but when you put that group of 4 players together, when it's Mitchell, Garland, Mobley, and Allen, all still pretty young, all look like they're going to continue to grow and improve together, whether it be as assets, if they feel like they need to move one of the guards or move one of the front court guys to get them to all work better together, or as individual players on the floor, all 4 of those guys still have tremendous value to me. I think they're still undervalued as a core, so I'd put them in tier 2. I would also put the Orlando Magic in tier 2. I am higher on them than I feel like most people are. The Franz Paolo combination, I think, is going to be awesome for them moving forward. They've continued to add veterans like KCP this offseason. They've got future picks still. They have guys that it feels like they know their role, like Jalen Suggs, that's going to go out there and just defend his butt off and just run around and just be a maniac on defense. They're improving some things in the front court. They got a couple guys they drafted the last couple of years that I think are going to be good role players. Orlando is an up-and-coming team for me, and I see no reason not to put them at tier 2 in this list. I also would put Minnesota up here, even though it's a little bit more uncertain post-Karl Anthony Towns trade. It does open up some financial flexibility for them, but also they've got guys like Rudy Gobert that could be getting a little older, getting a little bit worse. I ultimately landed on tier 2 with them because of Ant, who, although he hasn't won an MVP, certainly I think is going to be in contention for one over the next couple of years. And then they have McDaniels, a couple other guys, DiVincenzo, they got a first-round pick in the Knicks deal. Ultimately, I put them at tier 2. It just didn't feel right for them to be lower than that, given the Anthony Edwards effect. And then I also put Dallas, and that is obviously a Luka thing. They just made the finals. A couple guys on the roster, Kyrie, Clay, these guys are going to get older and worse. But ultimately, when you have Luka, when it seems like he's happy to be there and he's going to be one of the best players in the league over the next couple of seasons, tier 2 seems like about as low as you can go, unless it's a situation like we talked about with Milwaukee earlier, is all the way down there at tier 4 because they traded all their picks away and the entire roster is getting old. Also for the Mavs, I have to mention they also have Derek Lively, who's going to be good. They have some interesting pieces, I think, moving forward. Now we get to tier 1. These are the best futures in the entire league. There's only 4 teams left. These are the brightest futures. We begin with the San Antonio Spurs. It's Victor Wembanyama. It's all the picks. It's the young guys like Devin Vassell that are probably going to be good fits moving forward. They might win 40 games this year. A year from now, they might win 50. 2 years from now, they might be championship contenders. That's the kind of trajectory that the Spurs feel like they're on if they add a couple more pieces. And Victor Wembanyama could be the best player in the league in a year. And that just has to be accounted for when you're thinking about the future of their team. Also in this tier is, of course, the Oklahoma City Thunder. Them, a couple of other teams we're going to talk about here in a second. The Pelicans, they've always felt like they're at the top of these lists every year. I don't really feel like I even need to explain it. They still have a ton of future picks from teams like the Clippers that they could potentially get a lottery pick again this upcoming season. SGA, even Caruso and Hartenstein they added. Jalen Williams broke out. All these guys are just incredible. They've got the coaching stuff figured out. I would argue the Thunder have the brightest future in the entire NBA. Also in this section is the Houston Rockets. They have those Nets picks. They have some Phoenix picks as well. They've still got a ton of future assets, and they've got maybe the deepest roster in the entire league. If you go through like their top guy to their 12th guy, it might be the deepest group in the league, in addition to some young guys like Şengün, Jalen Green, of course, Reed Shepherd, who they drafted, even someone like Cam Whitmore. Lots of interesting young pieces for Houston. A lot of margin for error for them in terms of trying to build a contender over the next couple of seasons because they have all these picks and they have all this young talent. And then to finish off the video, the Boston Celtics have to be in tier 1. Not only were they the most dominant team from start to finish last year, even with dealing with some Kristaps Porzingis injury issues in the postseason, but they've got those guys locked up long term, and they still have a young core group of players in Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown, and then, you know, Derek White, a couple of other guys that are going to be really good for them long term no matter what. Even if Jrue Holiday falls off due to injury, even if KP falls off due to injury, they're locked in. They've spent some future assets, but I see no reason to think that a couple years from now the Celtics are not still going to be awesome. And that is the ranking of every single NBA team's future.